Hello and welcome to Hare and the Hawthorn. My name's Kate Ray and we've got Neil back on the sofa with me after me kicking him out when I was talking to people about their spooky experiences, because I did say, Neil, and I'm sorry I told the world that you are frightened by such things. And that's why you won't come in along to talk to my guests about ghosts. However, have pulled him along for a slightly spookier theme than normal, which is great, which is going to be, I think, a little bit of an eye-opener for Neil. Hope we don't get too frightening for you there, though. I'm sure you can take it. Just tell me to shut up. Tell me to shut up. It's my absolute pleasure. We've got Dr. Cal Cooper with us now. I'll say a little bit about Cal, and then I'll introduce him, and then I'll get him to talk about, fill in the gaps, really, because I've been looking through the body of work that Cal's been doing and has done in the past. His writing, his papers, the books that he's been involved in, on top of that, lecturing. So Cal works in parapsychology, and that's predominantly what we want to talk to him about, but has other areas of expertise that I'm sure we'll kind of touch on and bring into that. So welcome, Cal, and thank you so much for coming on in your time this evening. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Hi, Kate. Hi, Neil. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Can we just start off with filling in those gaps that I've left? There is so many. The body of work that you've done is quite immense. You know, when you look at, it's just reams and reams of pages and pages and pages of documentation. What do you do? You know, it's a stupid question, really, because there's lots.
I think I've managed to get to the prestigious point that I'm at because of just really hard grafting and going for it, and probably doing a lot initially just off my own back. This is probably why we've got the strikes going on today with the University College Union. I've done a lot for free to make sure that I get to the point that then people start wanting you.
Yeah.
But then there's still a lot of voluntary stuff that I do just because I'm so passionate about what I do. I think that's why a lot of people get into science. It's certainly not for the money. And so I am an associate professor at the University of Northampton. If people haven't heard that title in the UK, it's your halfway house between having your doctorate and being a professor. So I got my PhDs, and now I'm in that middle ground where I'm seen as someone that draws in a lot of research grants, produces a lot of research outcome and networking, and going to give guest lectures. So working towards becoming professor of my own discipline. But I am primarily, beyond being a chartered psychologist with the British Psychological Society, I'm primarily a parapsychologist. I lead the third year optional module within our psychology program of parapsychology and anomalous experiences, which is taught alongside a number of other colleagues, such as Professor Chris Rowe, Dr. David Saunders, Dr. Glenn Hitchman, Rachel Evenden, and Ewan McLean as well. So we've got a few parapsychologists working on the module and 15 members of staff involved in our research group that deals with parapsychology and consciousness studies and neuroscience, all interested in anything to do with exceptional experiences. But I cover a number of other topics as well. I specialize in death, dying, and bereavement. That was part of the focus of my first PhD, looking at anomalous experiences during a time of loss, sense of presence phenomena, dreaming of the dead, seeing them. And I also teach classes on human sexual behavior and positive psychology as well. So that's what I'm a psychologist first and foremost, but my PhDs have focused on parapsychology, death, dying, and bereavement, and positive psychology.
So when did you get into the parapsychology side of it as part of the psychology, or was it something that kind of sat within your consciousness before doing the psychology?
So I'd always had an interest in people having ghostly experiences, particularly hauntings. Ghost hunting was the thing that initially interested me, and then discovering that there was a branch of science to it that most people went for through psychology. So my initial training and interest was performing arts. I've always had an interest in that. I've got a memory like a sponge. I can hear people say scripts and recite it back really well. I even love it when I do a death, dying, and bereavement class to the students, and I start by throwing them, and I go, tomorrow, what's happening tomorrow? Tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty case. The last reported syllable of time, and all of our yesterdays like fools the way to dust down. And I'll go on and do some Shakespeare, and then talk about its significance within death, dying, and bereavement. But I love the theatre, I love performance. I'd made some films that got shown at Broadway Theatre in Nottingham, when I was at college, I did some film studies as extracurricular activity. I did British Sign Language and did a couple of qualifications. I was doing all sorts. And my A levels were in general studies, electronics, photography, and psychology. And I just didn't thrive in that environment. Psychology was very stale into examining bodies, conditions of it must be this answer and nothing straying from that, even if it's justified. And the university environment, I love better. Anything can be right so long as you've justified your case and argued it for and against, shown some critical thinking. Justify your position, defend it. And so I realized in going through, I suppose, college life and umming and ahhing about performing arts that there were so many people trying to get a qualification in drama and film studies that just because you've got a degree and waving it about, that's not going to achieve anything. Sometimes it's just knowing people that gets you in the right place, just being in the right place at the right time. So get a qualification that is handy for when you need to fall back on something. So I went for psychology, knowing that I could apply that to a number of forms of employment. It would be very useful to see that on someone's CV when you're applying for a job. But at the same time, I was discovering more and more that more universities in the UK were catering for parapsychology. Most popularly, we had the University of Edinburgh with the Coesler Parapsychology Unit, which has been going since the late 80s. Particularly before they really had a hub for it, they still had people like Dr. John Beloff, who had at least 5 or 6 parapsychology PhD students still going today with their research, even in retirement. So I went around a number of universities. I went to Liverpool Hope University, Northampton. I went to Hertfordshire, met Richard Wiseman at the time, looking at my undergraduate studies. Coventry University at the time had a master's in parapsychology. But I settled for Northampton. It got a number of staff members involved in parapsychology that had come from the Coesler unit. And I just felt very at home there. I really did pick it on feeling comfortable and feeling welcome, and that this could be a home for the next few years. So that's how I fell into it, knowing that I had to do a straight psychology degree, but it had opportunities and openness towards exploring parapsychology. And parapsychology, to define it, which you're probably going to ask next,
yes.
What is it? So it can be seen as a branch of psychology. People can look at it from the viewpoint of physics or anthropology, but it's primarily looking at human experiences or alleged abilities that don't seem to fit conventional scientific understanding. We don't have a working paradigm for how it happens. We don't understand the middle ground processes. We understand what it looks like and how it's experienced. How it's happening, we don't know. We could have conventional explanations for how it seems exceptional when actually there's some normal explanation for it. And then there's some instances where those normal explanations don't seem to account for it very well. And that's where parapsychology takes over. Once it's sifted that wheat from the chaff, it's got some nuggets left over of gold. What are these? What's going on there? And often psychology seems to approach those experiences because you're dealing with human abilities. There's animal studies and a number of other things and physical processes going on, but it's got a lot to do with human experience. So that's why psychology takes over.
Yeah. So can I just come in there to you? That's quite surprising what you say about the number of academic departments and people within them studying parapsychology at the moment, because you will read a lot about how difficult it is to get funding for this, especially I would suggest in American universities. And always Dean Radin, as you know, Dean Radin, who's always talking about how difficult it is to get funding. And but from what you're saying, maybe that's changed in the last decade or so. And so that's sort of one question. Has it changed in the last decade? And the second question is if you go beyond the academic departments into the societies, you know, psychological society or whatever, is it as well received within those sorts of institutions?
So there's a big difference between a university accepting parapsychology and funding for parapsychology. So a university accepting parapsychology could be that they take on a module of it and they teach it. In the first instance, it's a breadwinner for the universities. There's only about 12 UK universities that are government funded. The rest rely heavily on getting students in and meeting student numbers per course. And psychology is always a highly popular course for most universities. It's probably one of their biggest pulls. We have got about 12 UK universities that have a taught module for parapsychology. And then another 12 universities beyond that don't have a taught course within a degree, but have members of staff that have either trained in parapsychology have studied it previously and therefore can support a Master's of Philosophy, a PhD, or even perhaps an education doctorate or other forms of doctorate that have a parapsychology spin to them. That requires no amount of funding. When it comes to funding, there are a few funders from small seed corn funders, as we call them, that's a few £1,000s. But to be honest, most mainstream science studies need hundreds of thousands of pounds. But parapsychology can get by with a lot of goodwill and putting the money to good use in doing initial pilot studies, using that seed corn funding to then go for the bigger ones. So our big funders, I suppose, our main one is called BIAL, BIAL, and it's a pharmaceutical company in Portugal that funds only two topics, neuroscience and parapsychology, because the founders of that have had those primary interests, and that can reach about €100,000 or so, but quite consistently if you're regularly applying and the research is going somewhere. So some of our after-death communication research, I'm a BL recipient for that. But the money, it just disperses into what you're doing. We pay for a research assistant. It's paid for half a day a week amongst the other time, because all of our time is taken up with teaching and seminars and meeting PhD students and marking and all these other modules that we serve on. So it really gets dispersed. There's probably only a few people paid worldwide for being a parapsychologist, and I'm one of them, but it is probably only a fifth of my time amongst the other duties that I've got at the university. But I've still got a lot. 7 of my 8 PhD students are doing parapsychology. So the grants are there, but they're few and far between. What was the second part of your question?
Yeah, sorry, it's extending that the acceptance of parapsychology amongst the societies. How's that? How do you find your colleagues?
So at least with the British Psychological Society, they have a transpersonal psychology section. So that's dealing with religious and peak experiences, and I suppose exceptional experiences. So it has a very clear overlap and marriage to parapsychology. They're not directly testing claims of ESP or anything like that. It's more so about spiritual experiences, how people talk about religious experiences, what meditation can do for people. And there is also a section on consciousness studies and exceptional experiences, they called it. So it's a perfect domain for parapsychology to fit into. I think Jane Henry led on that for a while, and she might still do. She was based at the Open University. She is a psychologist and parapsychologist. She was an editor for the Journal of the Society of Psychical Research for a long time and has a textbook out as well. And so it fits into the British Psychological Society. There's even been articles on it in its magazine, The Psychologist, and the British Journal of Psychology has also had parapsychology papers in there. So no obvious criticism that I've seen jumping out, anyone kind of stamping their feet saying we can't have this. I think over time, especially since my time of being involved in parapsychology, as much as I came into it hearing about the backlash for employment it could cause if someone sees parapsychology in your CV, I've never really come up against it, but it could come down to an individual and their defense. I think I certainly know my field well enough to make sure that if anyone comes in with a very ad hoc comeback to parapsychology, why they don't like it, I will ask on what grounds they're basing that. If they say there's no evidence for psychic phenomena, I'll say that's a very broad claim to make. What individual paper do you know that I know that we can talk about, and you can tell me why you don't think it's a good paper, or why that's dismissing the evidence? There is no singular paper that has ever demonstrated that all of the evidence that's been collated over well over 150 years has dismissed everything. In fact, a lot of the founding of parapsychology at Duke University from the 1920s onwards, with J.B. Rhine and his wife Louisa Rhine, set standards for social science. They did randomization, which social science uses quite widely now. They shielded participant from experimenter, which is widely used. They used double-blind procedures, which is widely used now. We even talk about it with drug trials, using placebo and blinded trials. They use significance testing at a high level as well. They were working to P equals 0.005. They wanted to know that whatever you were doing in a randomized trial beat a 1 in 200 chance. That has now come down to 0.05 in all of social science. Whatever you're testing in such a way, can it beat a 1 in 20 chance? If so, you've probably harnessed and given a good method for whatever it is you're looking at, and you found it, because it's beat this 1 in 20 chance. And all these methods you've applied, hopefully, have shielded against anything else looking like something that you're looking for, like sensory leakage, like the participant knew what the outcome could be, and so they made an educated guess, or they just blurted that out, or they heard someone whispering in another room and they already knew that. All of those have been ruled against And so parapsychology set all these standards to make sure it cannot be anything via conventional means except for what we're looking for, that could only be achieved via extrasensory perception. And so there's all these kinds of arguments that I've built up against parapsychology setting a lot of standards that can be perfectly applied to the rest of psychology for what we might call very mundane human behavior. But it works really well in making sure you're doing a very good study. Even on the basics of what you want as an experimenter and what you expect can greatly influence your participants and how you interact with them. Even if you're not actually saying what it is you expect, your behavior will influence them. The same as them wondering what you're expecting of the study and how you act with them, whether you offer them a cup of tea or not, whether it's a cold drink or a hot drink, whether they feel good about the room or not, whether you're wearing a lab coat or casual clothes, all of that affects how they act. It feels like the dentist waiting room, and the fact that it's a very stale or clinical environment. It's always a squeaky door and someone just comes out with a very sad face, announces your name, and you're hearing a lot of drilling and murmuring in the background. It's not very good. You're not going to feel very pleasant about waiting your turn. It all matters. We're humans. We change day to day, and the slightest thing can affect our performance. How we perform one day in an ESP study or any other kind of study changes the very next day. We're not very consistent beings like a chemical in a test tube. And so I think acceptance has changed a lot over time because we've got a good grounding, we've got a lot of history, we've got a lot of evidence to present. And I think we've just stood our ground really well.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, Kate.
No.
I do need to say something that segues perfectly off from this, without sort of going too far down this route. I have to say, Cal, you're sounding very much like Rupert Sheldrake at the moment. It's that's a great compliment. Yeah. Now looking through your papers and your articles, I did notice and this segues exactly, it sort of goes to one side from what you've just been saying. And there's one, I think it was I don't know whether it's a conference paper or a poster, and it's Parapsychology's Battle for the Internet, a critical insight into the Wiki problem. Now, having just mentioned Rupert Sheldrake and people like, say, maybe Anthony Peake and Graham Hancock, basically you go onto their Wikipedia page and the first thing you see is that they're pseudoscientists. Is this what you were getting at in that poster or that paper, or are you trying to say something else more about that problem, that Wiki problem on the internet?
I suppose with the main Wiki, I mean, those people that you mentioned, they've been targeted by sub-branches of Wiki, which are not Wikipedia. I mean, the main thing was Craig Weiler, as a journalist, documented all of this. And in his second edition, I wrote the foreword to talk about the issues we have in universities across the board, not just for parapsychology, but other areas of social science from day one with undergraduates saying, this is why we don't use Wiki. The Encyclopedia Britannica online, and it's still a very good source. There is a major problem if we're dealing with a platform where people feel the need as editors to be anonymous. And also the fact that you have people that won't be named that control domains. And also the fact that it's a free editing platform. You can sign up and just become an editor, and that your credentials are not given. With these other encyclopedias, your name is given. The reason why you're an editor of that topic is also given. Why are you an authority? It's also important to have a neutral stance, that in anything that you give in an encyclopedia entry, you're showing the fors and the against, and a reasoned conclusion that makes sense in relation to why you're editing that page. It's understood that it's your conclusion, but it's still trying to give a neutral balance. I think a lot of people were understanding when there was a sudden shift with Wikipedia that parapsychology pages, and there's other issues with alternative medicine and other domains I'm not involved in, but I'm aware of it, even cryptozoology. I even know editors of Skeptic magazine who are cryptozoologists that have had a problem with this and said, go online to the wiki pages, and it's just not right. As radical as cryptozoology may seem about, animals that are undocumented but people have reported, wild cats and things like that I know nothing about, but they do. They say, it's not mirroring the actual research because there are people that have a problem with it and they've sent it in a certain direction. I know from experience as an authority in this domain that I could read a bio on Wiki of people like J.B. Ryan, and it's appalling that they'll save a last section called critical responses or criticisms. You don't see on many people's bios, and it's just a load of tarnishing that person's reputation after you've given it. It's not even the best reputation up to that point. I have been banned a few times from editing a few bios where I thought, that's just not true. And I've given the correct citations, and they might be parapsychology journals, so this is not a reliable source, or it's to a first-hand source. And you would have thought that's the best. Go right to the root of where did this start, or who said it in the first instance. And they won't accept that. It has to be a second, third, or fourth-hand reference. So something after the fact, or one that had an opinion on it later on. How is that reliable? So I think it's very telling when you actually look at the reference section as to where has all this page come from. It's very scary that a lot of pages are made up on someone's opinion after the fact. So parapsychology, it might have changed again. They've had to shift it slightly over time, but it did start parapsychology is a pseudoscience. It now says parapsychology is widely thought as to be a pseudoscience. And then there's probably about 7 references, which is quite a lot. But when you look at them, probably 2 of them are the same person, but in different sources. So that takes 2 out of the equation. That's down to 5. And the other 5 may be a skeptical survey of people that probably don't know parapsychology, so they've not really been sure how to respond properly to the data. So they said, I don't think it's a science, but at the same time, I don't know the data, but I'm still saying it's not science. And the others are other very critical opinions. I wouldn't even say skeptic, because they're people not working in the domain who don't know the topic. So how can you be critical about something you don't know about? And it's very sweeping. But there have been surveys on scientists' views of ESP and psychologists' views across the board of parapsychology. And when you look at those surveys that have appeared in the Skeptical Inquirer and other places, the majority of people in those surveys will say it's an accepted science. We accept that the data has been produced, but we still don't know what's going on. So it's still a lot of uncharted territory. So to say it's a pseudoscience after looking at surveys of a wide population of people that should have a fair understanding, saying, I accept it, but it's a domain that is meant to be learning stuff that we don't know, it's odd to call it a pseudoscience. A science is based on method, not on topic. If you are producing the same methodology as the rest of that domain, it's consistent, it's written down, there is a rule and law to how you do those data collections, how you process the data, and therefore, like baking a cake, you should produce the same outcome if you work with a recipe. If you're producing a random recipe, that is pseudoscience. You can't make up methods. You can't have unjustified rationales. It has to be known and within the system. Making up methods and bizarre random technology that you use. But parapsychology, as I mentioned to begin with, developed a lot of the things that we now use as standard practice within the rest of social science that has caught up. Even meta-analyses as well, where you take a whole bunch of maybe 50 studies that have all done the same thing throughout the globe. They found successful studies, they found failures, but you put them all together and say, but telepathy, which is what they all studied. What does it look like in all of these studies combined? How good is the outcome? You'll find that the outcomes are statistically significant and they're good. They're comparable to the rest of psychology, if not better in many of those instances as well. And so I think a lot of educational systems are just warning students that, you know, if you want a quick definition, if you want to quickly know about someone and some brief history, Wiki has its uses, but there are particular domains that you should be wary of. And as a good scholar, as a good person just wanting to do honest research, follow the paper trail. If someone has cited something and it doesn't sound quite right, then follow the paper trail. Where have those sources come from? And if they're not firsthand, you have then got the task of following that fourth-hand statement, take it back to the original account, because that opinion might be based on someone who just doesn't like the topic. And that's not good enough to dismiss a science. That's your own personal problem. I've even talked about this in interviews before, where I've been to a house party and someone said, what do you do for a living? And I'll think carefully as to whether I say psychologist or parapsychologist. So if I want them to go away, I'll say psychologist because it's fairly short and they're not interested. If it's parapsychology, it could go one of 2 ways. They'll either start telling me their life story about strange experiences, or they'll say, that's a load of crap. There's no evidence for that. I'll invite them to the university. I'll buy you coffee. I'll sit you in the library. You can have my access code to the printer. You can print as much of the stuff as you like, photocopy it. We've got thousands of journals supporting this in our archive alone, let alone the other universities and specialist libraries in the UK. And they've left at that point and said, oh, come on, we're going. Grab that part. And that's it. Really, you haven't got that job. No, it's nonsense. There's no such evidence. That's a strange comment to make because I am paid and it is my job and I teach these classes. and I'm doing that research. I know where it is. You can't tell me that these journals that I'm binding and having collected and helping the librarians out with this stuff does not exist. It does. There are failures, there are successful studies, and there's a lot of book reviews and commentaries and editorials. A record of this stuff does exist. You can't tell me it doesn't.
That takes me brilliantly onto what I've been dying from the beginning to ask, is about your own experiences, how you got into this. What was the you said it was before the psychology part of it that you got into the parapsychology. I'm always interested, especially when somebody's a parapsychologist, and I have met a couple and asked this question outright about parapsychologists are very well known for saying they're skeptical, and there's a sliding scale of being skeptical, isn't there? There's a kind of hardened skeptical that they don't believe anything, and actually what they're doing is they're producing data to back up that nothing is real within that area, or there's a sliding scale of, we've yet to get that data. So I think the first question is, was it a childhood trigger that got you into parapsychology? Was it something like Ghostbusters? Was it the usual kind of parapsychologist dream of watching Ghostbusters and thinking, that's the one for me? The other one is, on the sliding scale of skepticism, where are you? And I think the third biggie for me is, have you ever had a paranormal experience?
I don't think skepticism should have a sliding scale. You either are or aren't. Skepticism is critical inquiry. You know your topic that you deal with, and then you apply conventional explanations and see what's that. It's an Occam's razor approach. Yes. The least amount of thin razor slices that you take off of something, the fewest amount of layers is usually the most logical explanation for what you're dealing with. You're having to get through loads, it's probably too far-fetched, and it's getting off into this psychic processes or life after death. But we have some instances where, as we shave those layers of conventional explanations, they don't seem to fit the circumstance. They'd just be too far-fetched to suggest those. It doesn't work. And that's why parapsychology has some of these gold nuggets of cases. We even had Robert Bigelow presenting the Life After Death Essay Prize. It wasn't last year, it was just the year before. And that brought a number of us together looking at really those excellent cases that have stood the test of time, that are very hard to explain. And for viewers that weren't aware of that, he was offering $500,000 for a 25,000 word essay of the best cases and the best evidence of life after death, which has now moved through to the challenge, or something like that they've called it, which is an empirical test of survival that a number of people have started applying for. So you mentioned...
Can I just quickly, the winner of that was a chap called Jeffrey Mishloff, wasn't he? Yes. And that was one of the papers I read. It was an excellent paper, and Jeffrey runs, I've forgotten the name of the channel he runs.
Thinking Aloud. I'm a co-host on there, and I'm starting to do little bits of interviews to spread out Jeffrey's time.
Brilliant. He's a great guy, and I'm delighted he won it, but I'm kind of jealous that he won it as well. Yeah. So, sorry, I've interrupted. Go on.
Jeffrey is probably the only known person, because he's put it on record, to have won James Randi's $1 million prize, but through the back door in many ways. So when Jeffrey got his PhD in parapsychology, he got some slanderous statements by James Randi on him in a magazine somewhere. And so he sued James Randi, saying that his parapsychology PhD was bogus. And James Randi had no grounds on which to defend himself. It was a very unfair statement to make and publish in magazine. So he lost his case. He had to pay out to Jeffrey Mishloff, and Jeffrey Mishloff put it into real estate, and it made him $1 million or more. So
excellent.
James Randi's money from saying, parapsychology is, all unicorns and fairy tales and flim flam. He tried to make that attack and could defend himself in that instance. So there's that. So skepticism, back to that. I think you've only got this one instance, but you've mentioned people, producing studies and finding nothing. I think, again, it's what you're known for. So you might be thinking about people like Richard Wiseman and Chris French, and they're very known for being a skeptical figure in the media. And that's something that I think the public find hard to put to bed once they've seen what they're like on TV and the stance that they're told by the producers or whatever to present. And Chris French has, he's been involved in... He was editor of The Skeptic magazine for a long time in the UK, and Richard Wiseman's a member of the Magic Circle and knows a lot about deception and self-deception. He's frequently seen as a TV skeptic. So again, that experimenter effect, how a participant approaches someone and knows of their reputation and what they do. And, you know, it might seem like Chris French, Richard Wiseman are all about dismissal, but they're not. If they want to do one of these studies, I believe, knowing Richard and Chris really well, that they would genuinely be interested in an outcome that shows positive results. But reputation can sway the results. I'm not saying that's necessarily what's caused some of their results, but I'm not saying either that they've only produced studies that have got null results. That's not true either. They have had some successful studies, but they've probably had more null results than success. Whereas Rupert Sheldrake, who's very positive and supportive of the idea of psi, has had way more successes than he has had failures. Reputation does precede you in these instances because you're dealing again with people who will catch on to what you're known for. And so I think I have no more of a different a different approach of skepticism than does Richard or Rupert or Chris French or any of my other colleagues. We know the topic, we know what's come before it, we know where to find that information. And so when we do a study, we want to make sure the methods are good, they're tight, they're stopping anything else bleeding in, and we are just kind and polite and supportive of our participants. Whatever happens after that is down to human psychology, which we know will be all over the place. It'd be like trying to nail jelly to the wall. It's very hard to do. It's difficult. And so that's my stance on that. Have I had an experience, I think was one of your other questions, what got me into it?
Yeah.
It was more so growing up in Nottinghamshire. I've got Newstead Abbey on my doorstep, which is the former home of poet Lord Byron. I've been going for picnics there ever since I was a little boy. My grandma used to take me there. She took me to Blackfriar, Bosun the Dog, the White Lady. Still go there now. A dear friend and colleague of mine, Barry John, who's a known psychic medium, he was on Most Haunted for a bit. He's now a volunteer there, and we've done a few charity ghost hunts there as well. It's a I was about to say spiritual home for me. I suppose it is. I feel very nostalgic going there and comfortable going to I could just go to Newstead Abbey, not go in the house, just sit on the grass with a picnic blanket for several hours, read a book and go home. Just because it's on my doorstep and I know I can.
Cal, I've just got to stop you there, and I've just got to stop you there and say why both me and Neil are grinning like Cheshire Cats is because Neil has such an affinity with Newstead Abbey and with Lord Byron that it is his big passion. So as you're saying it, I can see Neil going, yes, there's somebody else out there.
Cal is now my new best friend. Any fan of Lord Byron is a friend of mine. Sorry, go on.
Byron's wonderful. We've got those links with Greece. We've got his sexual endeavors and things like that. There's all.
Let's not listen. We could go off the Lord Byron rabbit hole here, and this is not what we're supposed to be talking about. Even though I'd really love to spend the next half an hour just talking about Lord Byron. So, come on, Kate, pull us both back.
Okay, so experiences and how you got into this. Let's get back on track.
I didn't have any experiences that got me into parapsychology. As I say, performing arts was the way that I was going. It was between going to Newstead Abbey and my grandma telling me about people's experiences there, and then me learning further afield into the city of Nottingham about the Salutation Inn and the ye old trip to Jerusalem, both of them fighting about who's the oldest pub and their claims of hauntings. And I went to ghost walks as a kid. They're still doing ghost walks around those pubs now. That I just thought, you've got some people that seem like they're playing off their experience and they might have exaggerated over time, but other people seem to be very honest and sincere about their experiences. And so what's going on there? And it was a long
Keep going with it's just gone. That's it? Talk about Lord Byron.
Read some Byron.
He's back.
Sorry about that. Not sure what's going on. Sorry.
It was a long argument with the skeptical community against early psychical research. But people are only having these experiences because they're uneducated and they're dumb, and they just can't weigh up what's going on. If you haven't got a degree or you haven't got a position of power, that's why you're having these experiences. And there was a psychical researcher, Dr. Walter Franklin Prince, who was the first president of Boston Society for Psychic Research, that produced a book called Noted Witnesses to Psychic Occurrences that broke the chapters down into high court judges, police officers, scientists, poets, painters, and things like that. All people that were either highly creative, highly skilled, highly educated, and showing, look, they have experiences just the same. It's got nothing to do with what end of the educational spectrum you're on. If you're in the right place at the right time, you seem to have them. You cannot say that education is a contributing factor to having these. And so that's what interested me. It was a variety of people coming forward. And I would go to the local library in Ashfield with friends once a week at school. We'd have half a day of library time, or maybe it was just a class session that was just 10 kids' library. We walked down the road. Brilliant. And early internet was coming in. We would progress from Windows 3.1 to 95 and dial-up. Internet was just coming in. You could have 10 minutes at a time. But I'd go to the paranormal section. They only had 5 books, but we would take them out and rotate them. And me and 3 or 4 of the mates would look at these. And they had the Usborne book of Ghosts and Hauntings was there. And it mentioned, besides Borley Rectory and gaining my interest in Harry Price, it gave some mention to Jeff the Talking Mongoose as well, which I think was a very strange case. But it was one of Harry's as well, along with Richard Lambert. And that got me interested that, well, look, there's a long history to this. And Borley Rectory was very romantic in terms of it being this very traditional haunting and very scary and in terms of the kind of things reported. And I was reading them in a very, very dumbed down, publicly accessible, children's accessible format, but still knowing that this is based on truth, that these things happen. So I knew that, well, later on, performing arts and getting the psychology degree, I can gain perfect access to this stuff and really look at the original reports. And I became a member of the Society for Psychic Research as an undergraduate and started looking into these things. It was only during the time as an undergraduate and becoming a parapsychologist in training, psychologist in training, that I was going out on more haunting investigations. I was invited out that I would start to see things like movement of object phenomena and picking them up, and they'd be red hot. And they'd come from areas of the room that no one was stood. That, oh, you know, I've just been witness to something that I can't seem to find a conventional explanation for. That really is odd, but it's matching the eyewitness accounts of people that have been here before. And it's matching the textbook recordings of all this kind of poltergeist phenomena or whatever in all kinds of places of the world. It's textbook phenomena.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, nothing really before I got involved, but getting involved made you more aware of it. I've even given classes on out-of-body experiences to the undergraduates, showing the popularity in surveys of people reporting, say, out-of-body experiences. And naturally, parapsychologists were in 40 to 50% relating to or being aware of OBEs because they're aware of the literature and what it's like. Yeah. And students are about 25%, the general population are about 12%. Because they're not immersed in it. They don't know it. They don't know what it is when they experience it. Psychokinetic phenomena is about 2 or 3% of the population relate to it. But how does someone that's never read parapsychology or even interested in paranormal know that movement of a glass on the table was just because it wasn't put there right and it's fallen over, or is at the edge, or it had some condensation on it and it slid, or it couldn't possibly have done that. It was none of those factors and it did slide. How are they weighing it up? They're not thinking, oh, it just smashed. I probably didn't put it down right. So it's very hard to tally what was happening and what wasn't happening. And just because if you don't know about it, how would you know to put it down to this? How would you put that label on it if you're not aware there is such a label?
Definitely.
So, yeah.
I mean, I think with one of the reasons why I set up this channel, and I was telling you just before, was because I was going out on ghost hunts as a paranormal investigator and coming across non-human energies, entities that not only myself but other people were experiencing outside of the ghost hunt. And I became sort of the go-to person when it became fairies, the label of fairies. When people were experiencing things that were very much within that realm, that they didn't fit the demonic model, they didn't fit the spirits of the dead model, that anything other came to me, and that's why I came up with wanting this channel to be there. And it's because if people don't know sort of a good basis of maybe folklore or research into fairy phenomena encounters, just as an example, they will lump it in. Generally, they will lump in these experiences with demonic or with malicious energies. And on that note, one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about, and I know that we're kind of rattling on with time, no, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. No complaints there. But I found, I mean, I've studied a bit of parapsychology. I studied for a little while under Kieran O'Keefe. And one of the things that I found was that there seems to be very little in the way of parapsychology study when it comes to I mean, the spirits of the dead are there, and what happens in the afterlife is there, and there is studies into exorcisms and demonic behaviour, but there doesn't seem to be any great bodies of work around other, you know, the you know, the possibility that there are other energies and entities in the world.
I think it's because there's no foundations on which to start with that, but there's plenty of foundation on the very people that would push around the idea, and that's us. And so that's why it comes back to psychology again. And so let's stick with what we know of culture. Let's stick with what we know of anthropology. Let's stick with what we know of belief systems. Let's stick with what we know of theology and creating morals and meaning and ideas of life and death, because they're human creations. But after we remove religious interpretation and cultural interpretation, what phenomenology of human behavior do we have left? We have a lot of consistent things. Apparitions of the dead have been reported in all cultures for thousands of years. And if you strip away, even going back to ancient Egypt, the ideas of the afterlife and the different animal-headed gods, their views on experiencing ghosts are very similar to today. They haven't shifted whatsoever, which shows that probably as long as humans have been around, we have had premonitions of things before they've happened in dreams or in a waking state. We have felt the presence of deceased loved ones. We have seen them. We have smelt them or heard their voice. It's just a religion based on it, or a cultural opinion on it, gives some sort of meaning or context to it. Without that, we're a bit adrift as to what it really means, and it's for you to make personal sense of it. And if that's all you're left with, then they can be very good for coping and moving forward and getting on with life, thinking, well, actually, if it has really confirmed for me that something else is going on, then why should I be so worried about death? Because actually, it will relieve me a lot of things, physical pain and aging and a number of other things that are actually slowing me down physically. But mentally, I become free and reunited with all these people that I've enjoyed. And so that's probably why, there's not a lot of outlets for studying spiritual entities and the idea of them and what the afterlife may be like. But this is the exciting thing about universities and research degrees. Everyone is always looking to undergraduate degrees and what master's degrees come and go, which is certainly a selling point for universities. But if you've already got one of those and you are really interested in entities of possession, you are really interested in concepts of the afterlife, sign up for a research degree at any university where you know there are members of staff that clearly have an interest in this, from whatever take, philosophy, history, anthropology, psychology, physics, you name it. If you sign up, your research degree can be on anything you like. There are funded degrees where you can just walk through the door and pay the tuition fees. And you can set your question and then start enjoying the books and the journals and either doing history trails or new empirical research to your heart's content. And so I don't think there has to be structured courses on it. You make your course and you make your discoveries through a research degree and have it assessed by other experts as well as having your own research team that guides you to that final point of having a finished thesis. So there's all these quick and ready courses. I know Kieran talked a bit about exorcism in what he was doing with the School of Parapsychology online. There are very simple kind of continued professional development certificates. The Coesler Parapsychology Unit has a foundation certificate in parapsychology through the University of Edinburgh. There's the Australian Institute for Parapsychological Research. They do a couple of online certificates. All for CPD, it teaches you the basics of parapsychology. But from there, just hit the ground running with the books. I always say that there's two different types of parapsychologists if you want to become one. You either don't have any higher education training and you just read and read and read. You're reading the journals, you're reading the books. Or you become an academic and you get the degrees and you immerse yourself in the research and teaching research methods and areas of that domain, physics, psychology, sociology, whatever, that has nothing to do with the paranormal because it's part of your contracted job. It's the middle ground that I hate, where people go online and they get all of these qualifications and certificates within a few weeks for a lot of money by nobodies who know nothing and then start calling themselves a doctor, a psychologist, a parapsychologist, a folklorist, a demonologist. There are only 2, 3, maybe 4 at most that are legitimate. The rest are nonsense. I'm seeing them all the time and it's scary. Don't kid yourself. Go that route. Don't buy anything. Just buy yourself some books. Yeah. And read them and read a lot and attend free lectures when you can, because if you're a member of something for £30 a year, you'll probably be able to attend a dozen lectures and go to the library as much as you damn well please, take out as many books as you like within that organization. Do that. Don't lose it on a qualification that's not worth the paper that it's written on. Or if you have got the money or you've got the time because there's a grant source or whatever, then go the academic route. If you want a bachelor's or a master's or a PhD or whatever, do not do the middle ground. One or the other. Read or go the academic route.
Here, totally agree.
Sound advice. Yeah.
Definitely. Literally, we've got about 10 minutes left, and there is one other bit that I kind of want to squeeze in here, and it's going to be a ridiculous squeeze job. I know it is. I'd been watching some of your work develop that you talked about online on social media, that you were doing experimentation with flotation tanks and deprivation, and I would really like to hear about all of it, really, about how it started, where it was going, what were you looking for, what were your results?
Okay, so hold on, before you start, Cal, before you even start talking about that, I want to know what you think about John Lilly before you start talking about what you're doing, if you don't mind.
I can't talk about it without John Lilly. I mean, John is this kind of spiritual figurehead for what we're doing. And there's some beautiful T-shirts with him laying a tank with his Davy Crockett hat. He was interviewed in the original Thinking Aloud before Jeff took it to YouTube, and it was called New Thinking Aloud, and it became a YouTube channel. So if we go back into the 80s, he interviewed John Levin, and he was there. And so where did this all start? Well, for a long time, when I'd attend Society for Psychical Research conferences, and we'd have all the lectures done for the day, and everyone's having their dinner or a president's drinks reception, or they're hanging about in the pub, and people would jokingly talk about getting a flotation tank for a university, and there'd be laughter, and then it would go on. But why is it a funny concept to get it? And then when I started to look into it, it was the money. The tanks are very expensive. You're looking at a minimum of £20,000, but beyond that, that's probably not an issue. It's more so, where do you keep it? What room do you have? Why would the university let you just have a whole room for that? Does it have suitable filtration? Does it have suitable sources for filling the tank? Does it have shower facilities? What are you going to do with the Epsom salt? Where are you going to store all of that? Because you need a lot. That water is about 53% salt against water. So you need a lot of salt. Last fill up we did, we used over 12 bags of the stuff. And you have to get a forklift truck to bring it in, and then a van and several people to bring it in to us. And we have to spend a whole day diluting it with our feet, swirling it around in cold water before it heats. It takes a long time. And this is working with a very crude and mundane version of the tank. The commercial tanks are a lot bigger, the size of a small town car, with a really big filtration unit on the back that filters every hour. It all goes back to the 1950s, where you've got people like Peter Sudfeld and John Lilly that are looking into sensory deprivation. So it was the early behavioral studies in psychology. It's up there with the Milgram studies of believing that you're electrocuting someone in the next room and ask to increase the voltage. You keep pressing the button, you're hearing them screaming more and more. You don't want to, but the man in the lab coat says you must continue. This experiment requires you do, to the point that you stop hearing them screaming, and yet you're told to still electrocute them. And you think something's gone on there. I think I've killed them, but this person's telling me, keep pressing the button. Even through to, what happens if I cut a rat's feet off and stick it in a freezer? Will it panic? Will it get anxiety? And doing things like, why did they do those studies? But they were trying to compare a lot of animal behavior to, well, if we did this to a human, it's probably going to be the same as what we're seeing in the animal. So we'll test the animal, because at the time we're seeing this as ethically sound because we're not doing it on humans. But that's what was going on. You got a lot of crude studies going on. Sensory deprivation wasn't too bad in psychology. They were sending people into caves with minimal lighting conditions, but the appropriate supplies that they needed, or put them in buildings where the windows are shut out and the clocks are taken away. And so they have no sense of daytime and nighttime. It's all taken away. What does it do to someone? And we see that there are time shifts. You can't accurately know time, what's happened with the passage of time. It can start to affect your immune system. It will affect your skin. We do need lighting conditions. It affects depression levels as well. We need that UV. It does keep us happy. It's really good for us, as well as the skin as well. With, I think it's B12 for sunlight and things like that. And so they were looking at what happens to our state of consciousness in brief periods when you are in isolation. The initial studies that they did involving water and isolating by that was full submersion. So it was like a very crude diving bell suit. If you imagine those old ones with the big brass helmets and screwing the face mask on, and someone pumping oxygen down to you, at least two people, and then you'd pull on a cord if there was a problem. You know, 2 pulls for this and 3 pulls for that, and they bring you up again with these cast iron boots, so you could walk on the seabed. Really, really crude and dangerous stuff when you think back to it. These discoverers going down pearls and looking at sunken wrecks. But in the labs, they got something that was more so a big tank and wires, and they could submerge someone and see, well, an hour, 2 hours, what's going on down there. For us, you're seeing something that's a complete predecessor to the Ganzfeld, which we've used for a long time in parapsychology with reclining chairs, eye shield, red light, and trying to get you relaxed and in a state of going to sleep, but not quite there. So the hypnagogic state where you're drifting, but you're still so aware of your environment that your body doesn't quite want to get you there. But it's very then prone to imagery and sound that can come through in hallucinations through the eye shields, where you're getting this pink haze because of the red light coming down. You may get that underwater. And so they shifted that after a time. Popular media was picking up on it. So in 1963, you've got the film The Mindbenders with Dirk Bogarde and Mary Ure. Mary Ure was the wife of Robert Shaw, who ended up in Jaws as Quint the shark catcher. So Mary Ure and Dirk Bogarde, Jaws is my favorite film, by the way. I watched it time and time again. You would have thought Ghostbusters, but no, Jaws is Ghostbusters is on the list. Dirk Bogarde, Mary Ure, Mindbenders, they talk about the progression from full submersion to understanding more about isolation. They thought it had something to do with temperature, and they this idea developing. And then John Lilly was known within psychology for this. Psychology was adopting the Ganzfeld for looking at sensory isolation. And then in 1969, the Parapsychological Association, which in the same year became an affiliate of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, so it was recognized, the actual body, Parapsychological Association, was recognized as a branch of science by the AAAS. That same year, John Lilly gave the guest dinner speech to the organization in New York City. And it was called Parapsychology in Inner Space. And he talked about his use of the flotation tanks, how they promote imagery very well. You're in there floating naked in the dark, in this Epsom salt with your eyes open, and you see all this kind of imagery. It's kind of like looking into a kaleidoscope, if you've ever played with those, where you turn the end and you see all these images folding into each other. I think it's very much like cigarette smoke in the dark as well. Someone's smoking them, blowing large clouds, and it drifts and it's grey and it moves in and out. And he said, well, where is this coming from? Is it our own creativity, or is it coming from some other source and our brain's picking up on it and showing it in this imagery in the tank? The only way you could know is, why don't you get 2 tanks, 2 sets of people, one sends, one receives, and test it that way? He proposed it. No one ever did it. There were people that had a go at buying them. Stefan Schwartz, he bought a tank and used it at home, well-known parapsychologist. Guy Playfair, who's well-known for the Enfield Poltergeist and other things, wrote a good book on twin telepathy. He had a go at one during the time that he was doing Cole Sargent's Ganzfelds. So a few parapsychologists, psychical researchers had a go, but it never went through to formal studies. By 1980, D. Scott Rogo, who we've just reprinted his well-known text, Parapsychology Association Inquiry. He did a pilot study, really basic, 3 participants, 4 trials, not enough to even get statistical significance. So he said, I'm more so interested in, does it work? Is it a useful thing to use? And it seemed promising, even though it got nothing interesting out of the participants. That same year, Altered States as a film came out, which talked about the flotation tanks. And there's a very strange ending. If no one's ever seen it, go and check it out.
Scared the bejesus out of me, that did.
Very, very, very strange. Makes me think of The Fly in some ways.
Yeah.
And then we have other things.
Hold that thought.
Have you got it? He's got it. So
that's
there we go.
That's the book it's built, but based on by the guy I can never pronounce the name of. But
even the Mindbenders, there's the novel, so you can get the novel Mindbenders as well as the 1963 film as well. And then we have series like Fringe. If you've ever seen Fringe, that adopted flotation tanks. It's a sort of a cross between the FBI working with the university that is more than happy to dabble with these few individuals with parapsychology and crime scenes, which actually appears to be linking with alternative dimensions, linking over, so hyperspatial models. And there was also a series called Sea of Souls, which was BBC Scotland that made up, I think it was called Clyde University, that had a parapsychology department. And it was just taken very seriously that is a parapsychology department led by Bill Patterson as the lead parapsychologist in it. And he's got his PhD students, and they encounter exceptional participants that have a backstory to them, that you end up going on a sort of a personal journey that you probably never get a university lecturer showing such concern for a participant and, you know, going out their way to sit out in their car all evening, figuring out what's going on here, or building. And they adopt a flotation test, but it never translates to practical studies. And so we did a pilot study in 2016. We went to a commercial centre. We just adopted the Ganzfeld protocol. I'm in the tank. I'm writing down and recording after I've been in all the hallucinations and images I had. At the same time, my colleague, Dr. David Saunders, is at Northampton, looking at one of 4 randomly selected clips. He doesn't know what pool they're going to come out of, this pool of 4. And then he makes a note of which one it was and what pool it's in. And then that all goes off to an independent judge along with all of my drawings. And they have to weigh up, right, which one of the 4 clips is most likely what Cal was seeing and experiencing. So one is going to be the target and the other 3 are going to be decoys. So we did that as a pilot study. I think I got 3 out of the 12 and the independent judge got 4 out of the 12. But we only did 12 trials. We need at least 40 really to start looking at statistical meaning and significance out of it. So we didn't do enough. But again, we went from Rogo's 1980 study to doing another pilot all that time on because no one else had done it. And it showed a lot of promise. We wrote a very extensive pilot paper for the Journal of the SPR, got a little bit of funding to do that in the first place. We bought a flotation tent, which are no longer produced. So we got it just in time, set it up. And we got some funding from Perrott Warwick at the University of Cambridge, which supports psychical research studies, and then BL at the same time. And this has afforded us a lecturer and PhD student, Kirsty Allen, who was one of the co-Esler parapsychology students. She was working towards the idea of doing a PhD with Bob Morris, who produced about 32 PhD students under his name in parapsychology. He unfortunately passed away very suddenly in 2004. So she was one of the few students at the time that had ambitions for parapsychology, but Bob passed away and things changed. So things have gone full circle. She was doing a master's related to parapsychology, saw this job post opportunity, and she got it. So now she's back in a strong parapsychology unit with us, with Bob's legacy. I'm one of Bob's grandchildren in a way, because Chris was my supervisor and Chris was supervised by Bob. So we have all these first generation supervised by Bob, and then those that super. So I'm a grandchild of this tree, grandchild to Bob Morris. And Chris is on the team, and also Glenn Hitchman, who was previously supervised by Richard Wiseman for his master's at Hertfordshire, and he's our psychology department lead. So that's where it is. We have a PhD student, Kirsty Allen, full-time dedicated to this. We have a flotation attempt for the first trials. We've done some pilot trials. And then after this, we've got 2 more big studies to go. And we haven't even got all the data completed. So we don't know what we've got really at the moment, what's happening.
Right. I mean, it sounds like that first initial studies that you looked at were to do with telepathy. Where else can that go? Where else can the kind of flotation tank deprivation experiment take you?
Well, you could do a telepathy test. That's at least what John Lilly was presenting and proposing. But there was no need for us to have, and we sort of realized this part way in, and we thought, we'll stick with what we're doing and follow it through the end. There was no need for David to be sat there watching the video clip, because we've done remote viewing trials by the same method with no one there as the computer plays it to itself. Because the idea could be that in your mind's eye, you're traveling to that room and watching the computer clip, because it does exist somewhere, or it could be a future event that's selected that is going to happen anyway. We know it's going to happen. It's not been selected yet. We do a lot of trials that are precognitive, where it helps with a double-blind, if not more, procedure, because the experimenter doesn't know what it's going to be. The participant doesn't know what it's going to be. It's not selected until after we're all done. And so the target is made aware of to all of us after we've completely completed everything. We ask the computer, what have you selected? And so David didn't need to be there at all. I mean, I know David really well. So in a way, in my mind's eye, I was going to the room. I could see David sat there. I'd think about peering over his shoulder and looking at a computer screen and what it could be. But I suppose it's kind of like a grounding. It's something to latch onto, that there's a person you can relate to. And we've done some remote viewing studies like that, where a good friend or a family member of yours has gone to the location, can you think about them? But you don't need to. You can just think about, there's a location for you, travel, where are you going? So telepathy could be one, a mind-to-mind interaction, and you feed on those thoughts of that person. But it could be more clairvoyant in terms of you're retrieving information at a distance, it's coming from somewhere, and so you're remotely viewing that information. Tell us about it. So there's more so those two things. You could add a precognitive element. You could make a flotation tank study precognitive again. You could have a target set up, but you don't know until after you've done what's selected, because you're not allowing the computer to select until everything's done and dusted. You've signed off on all your mentations, your images, what you're thinking about. And after every trial's done, the experimenter goes, right, computer, give me a random number, give me a video clip. And it's decided after the fact. So that helps in any criticism that, well, the experimenter influenced it because they already knew the targets. Well, it doesn't really matter. They had no involvement. The computer decided after they were done what it would be. So how could they influence it?
Yeah.
Totally agree. And I think, I mean, I could talk to you for the rest of the evening about the relationships people have, and, you know, the studies of twins and their kind of ability to be able to read each other's minds and you know, and all that kind of thing. But I am very aware that we're kind of eating into your evening, and
it's okay. I've got cheese and biscuits and wine. I'm good to go.
And you're not offering us any. I'm sat here with a cup of tea.
Actually, I tell you, I finished off the wine. I'm now on the last bit of some cream soda.
Neil, have you still got your wine on the go? Because I feel like I'm left out now.
Of course I have, and I win the competition for the best goblet.
I think I would love to have you back on, Cal, at some stage, maybe later on in the year, to digest and dissect all of this. We often get viewers asking comments, so maybe that's something we could come back and have a chat about. But it is just such a huge world of parapsychology, and as you're talking, I'm like with questions, and as I'm sure Neil is, you know, Neil's thinking, oh, it's this, you know. And when he talked about OBE, it was like, Neil is going to get him on OBE for forever, because that's definitely one of Neil's babies, isn't it?
I have been reining myself back in, not just on Lord Byron, but on the OBEs. I want to talk to you more about psychedelics and how you know John Lilly, as you know better than I do, was an enthusiastic user of certain psychedelics.
It went in a strange direction with the LSD and ketamine mixes that he was having. He would spend about 5 or 6 hours inside the flotation tanks towards the end. His own self-destruction led to his own destruction.
On very large doses, the sort of mega doses, amazing. But that will be a conversation for another day, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. OBEs, flotation tanks, and psychedelics sounds like the brilliant title for the next time we meet up. Thank you so much for your time, Cal. If you just stick around as I hit the stop button, it'd be nice to just catch up and have a chat with you. And thanks everybody for listening. If you're liking the YouTube channel, it really helpful to us if you give a thumbs up. I've never done this before. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, leave comments, let us know that you're out there. It's so useful to us about the content that we give you, how long, length of time, etc. Anyway, I'm going to shut up because I've had too much caffeine as per usual, and we will see you on the very next one. Thank you, Cal. Thank you, Neil.